and engagement later, so we'll start. Let me very quickly take a moment to introduce the panel and also talk about why are we here. So a very formal welcome to this panel on regulating online gaming by the Quantum Hub TQH and in partnership with the All India Gaming Federation, AIGF. I am Rohit, I'm one of the founding partners at TQH and I'll be moderating this discussion. So as you know, the online gaming industry has grown tremendously over the past couple of years. And it is one of the fastest growing sectors in the economy, but what has unfortunately happened is that regulation has not kept pace, it has lagged behind. As a result, most players in the ecosystem are essentially operating in a regulatory vacuum. What that has meant is that it has increased risks for entrepreneurs, investors, and even
Recording in
consumers.
progress.
And what is complicating the matter even further is the center versus the state tussle and the ambiguity on what is legal, right? So therefore, the industry actually has been in conversation with the government for many years to try and sort of create some regulatory framework. And with the latest amendments that the ministry has proposed to the IT rules, the government has taken a step in that direction. Obviously, there have been these conversations that there needs to be a separate legislation and we shouldn't be doing it through the IT rules, but that's a separate discussion. And so these amendments have led to a lot of chatter. There have been questions about their efficacy. There have also been questions about what it means for the online gaming industry. And the goal of today's panel is essentially to unpack these amendments and try to understand the implications that it has in store for us. So, and that's the goal. And the government is actually taking comments till the 17th of January. I know a lot of people here are hoping for an extension. We might get one, but if we don't, then we hope that these discussions that we are having feed into some of the recommendations that the government is thinking about. So to discuss the rules, I am joined here by a very stellar panel. Let me quickly introduce them. First, Shahana Chatterjee, who is a partner at Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas. Saloni, who is actually joining us online. She is the founding partner at Lumikai Fund, an interactive media and gaming focused fund specifically. Then we have Zara on my right. She's a gamer with several years of experience in esports and video gaming and is also representing the Esports Players Welfare Association. And Rutuja, who is the government affairs lead at Ikigai. And finally, Dhruv, the tech policy advisor at AIGF, also a partner in crime for this panel. So thank you everyone for taking the time to be here. Let me actually start the discussion. I wanted to split our discussion into three parts. In the first section, I wanted to essentially cover the overall regulatory framework that is being proposed and what is the kind of approach that is being adopted. So Shahana, if I may turn to you, can you give us some insight into what is the thinking behind these amendments and the broad view of what they're trying to achieve? Is there clarity on the different kinds of game formats that will get covered?
So let me start with your first question, Rohit. And before that, thank you so much for organizing this event. I think, of course, a very timely event and also, fantastic panel. I think you'll get some really interesting perspectives. Let me start with your first question. I think the idea with these amendments have been a long time coming, right? I think there's been a lot of engagement between industry and government about coming up with some sort of framework to give regulatory clarity. There has been an escalation of that engagement after we've seen a couple of these unfortunate orders from the GST authorities, and again, based on a lack of clarity on, what ultimately is a game of skill, what ultimately is a game of chance. And that discussion itself is so wrought with issues of center and state division, how some of the states are regulating, online betting and gambling, etc. And I think this was an attempt by the government to try and work out a middle path without going into conversations of ultimately, center-state issues and without ultimately going into discussions of defining what is a game of skill. Or rather what is not a game of chance. And so the idea was to create something of a regulatory framework. There was a lot of back and forth within the government and across the industry about who would be the nodal ministry, who would be the entity within the government who would take charge of this. And it's very interesting that it landed with MeitY because they're really approaching this from an intermediary perspective, right? And so you see a lot of the focus of the amendments is really on the platform and what the platform has to do rather than on what the gamers or what the developers have to do. And so I think it's an outcome of what I believe has been an industry ask, that there has to be some sort of regulatory clarity, and an outcome of an understanding across the government that this is really the neater way to come up with a regulatory framework without stepping on toes of where the state may have powers or where judicial pronouncements would have to be relied on to determine what is a game ultimately. So I think that has been the impetus, and I think one of the overarching concerns that the government has had with some of the formats of games, of course, have been the kind of financial risk it has created. We've seen, for example, an increase in law enforcement access requests for what are now known as OGIs, relating to financial fraud investigations. And there's been a sharp increase in those sorts of LEA requests. And so that is again a concern that we've seen reflected in the amendments. And there has been this underlying concern with some of the other formats of games about what sort of addiction risk it can create, especially amongst children. So, I think it's a culmination of a couple of these concerns that the government has had as well.
And what about the different game format? Is there clarity on what's covered?
Loaded question. See, I think obviously if you look at the definition, the attempt is to try and include as many formats as is possible. They have made the definition deliberately fairly wide, right? And online game is anywhere where there is a deposit, where there is a winning that is given to a user, etc. Now, if you start breaking this up across certain formats of games, I think for real money gaming, for example, it's a clearer inclusion in an application. I think the more you move towards, say, tournament-based games, or where you move towards esports, you can try and argue for some of those formats that perhaps it is not really applicable because, as a user, I'm not really making a deposit to participate in the game. I may be making a payment as, an in-app purchase for certain features that will enable me to perform better within the game. I think there are some of those arguments to be made, but I think taking a step back from a strategic point of view, I'm not sure what the outcome of that would be, right? I think there is this regulatory framework that is now being offered. It will help to a certain extent give comfort both to the users and to the government, that you are a platform that is subject to this regulatory framework, that you are subject to these norms and regulations that these SRBs are going to put in place, which is going to address everything from harm to children to financial risk, etc. And that helps kind of reduce a little bit of the regulatory uncertainty that gets created. And I think Saloni can speak to this more in terms of how this has really created challenges for investments that are coming into this sector. Because investors, especially foreign investors, are finding it very hard to grapple with the very nuanced issues that this sector throws up about, not just is this a question of, we have to resolve whether this is a game of skill or chance. How do we get certainty about that issue? What are the sorts of indemnities, what are the sorts of reps and conditions that we need to put into our investment documents to make sure that we are safeguarded against this risk? So it created a huge amount of ambiguity. So ultimately, perhaps for certain formats, you could make an argument that it doesn't really neatly apply, but I'm not sure whether that's an argument we'd want to take.
Okay, great. No, that helps. And I think, let me call on Rutuja to actually build on that. And also, Given what Shahana just said about the fact that there's lack of clarity possibly on some of the game formats that might be covered, to what extent will these rules, sort of plug the legal vacuum, so to speak, where will there still be formats that are sort of not covered? Will those guys have to do advocacy again? So the uncertainty may continue. And then also, do they diminish the roles of the states? I know that Chana spoke about it a little bit, but it'll be good to understand that what will be the interplay between the central rules and state laws. And does it also mean that that question on what is a game of scale, game of chance, all of it continues as it was?
Thanks. Hi. It's okay. Okay. Hi, guys. Good morning. Thanks, Rohit, for the questions and for inviting me here. I think all fair questions. But I think in terms of what these rules are trying to address, they don't want to get into the conversation of formats, but it's more on legitimizing what the industry and responsible gamers have been trying to do in this space. In a way, they are recognizing that this industry exists and what they're doing is legitimate. And the rules prescribe, from a larger perspective, they're ensuring that there is due diligence, there is responsible gameplay, user harm is addressed, and there's accountability between the stakeholders of this industry. That's what these rules are trying to address. They're not overstepping in the sense on a state's authority or its ability to be able to legislate on gambling and betting. That is still with the states, right, under the constitutional the lists. So from that perspective, they don't get into the state, the skill versus chance debate at all. It's about whether here are XYZ lists of due diligence you have to do, and what do you do under them, and how do you go about executing it. And I think in terms of just how the rules go about addressing bad actors, the rules are also giving the government some authority to identify the bad actors and call upon them under Section 69A of the Act, of the IT Act. And to that extent, the rules also give the government a certain amount of teeth in calling out the bad actors. But at the same time, it doesn't overstep on the state, saying, we will be the ones regulating what can potentially mean online gambling or betting.
And I'll actually subsequently come on to this question later, Zara, to you, but the esports thing, will that vacuum still continue?
I think that still goes back into the conversation of the format, right? This is still, and like Shana said, it's online game, and the definition is purposely wide for a reason, so that anything which is offering a gaming format gets covered by these games.
So that'll get covered.
Correct. And the second item that I also wanted to add was they have a new clause in the draft rules. I think it's 6A, which says that if there is another kind of format that the government thinks needs cognizance of, they will be able to add it into the rules.
Which is something they've had in the IT rules across the board, that they can specifically, separately identify and
add new things.
Okay. Yeah. No, thank you, that helps. Let me actually go to Saloni. Shubham, if you can sort of take her online. Saloni, the question I had for you is building on what Shahana had also said, that the online gaming industry has grown rapidly over the past few years. But many say, and I wanted to hear your perspective, that regulatory confusion has, made investors somewhat jittery. So what is your perspective, and what have been experiences of some startups, for instance, that you've invested in, and what are the kind of things you've been considering as you look at investments?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, and my apologies that I'm on video. Look, I think first and foremost, when a lot of the narrative and noise in India around gaming has largely centered around real money gaming or cash gaming, right? And if you were to take a step back, gaming is much broader, much wider, much deeper than what we perceive than it to be just RMG, right? A lot of people mistakenly think that RMG is about 80-90% of the market in terms of just revenue size. And actually, data will show you that's not correct. There is a very large and broad ecosystem of gaming, whether it's content, whether it's platforms, whether it's tool tech infrastructure, which essentially exists in the Indian ecosystem at the moment. And as a fund, the way we look at the sector has been through a much broader lens than what is often commented and debated about. Now, from our perspective, I think we are very bullish, and we remain very bullish on gaming because a large number of macro factors and macro indicators and on-ground inflection points have led the gaming industry to a point where it is. Now, with respect to RMG gaming and investor sentiment around it, I think there are two camps of investors, right? The first camp of investor who has felt that it is better to ask for forgiveness rather than permission, and you set up these companies, and you essentially build, and eventually regulation will catch up. And then there are another set of investors who essentially steered away from RMG at a point of time where there wasn't enough regulatory clarity, or they felt that there were certain regulatory gaps or lacunae. As a fund, Lumika has kind of been on the latter camp. We're by far India's most active games and interactive media investor, and we haven't had any RMG bets in the portfolio. Now that may change given the current regulation and us getting comfort from that. Now, in the former camp, there have been many investors who've taken those bets and who have seen their companies become exceedingly successful. And sometimes that kind of an approach of, we're going to build these companies and eventually regulation will catch up, do work out. Sometimes it doesn't. If we see, for example, what's happened in crypto, regulation did not catch up. In fact, regulation actually went the complete other way, where there was extreme taxation, and now you've got a lot of foreign investors stuck in Indian bourses who are concerned about what the exit horizon for those companies are. And a lot of those companies, particularly the crypto companies, haven't been able to achieve scale, and a lot of the co-founding teams, etc., have split. Now, I guess coming back to more RMG-centric regulation, the way we have also looked at so one is, the intent and the spirit of the regulation and legislation, and then second is what is the semantics and the wording of the regulation per se in the policy proposed, right? To us, there is a very clear intent towards regulating and providing some kind of framework for cash gaming. There is very clear indication about users putting and depositing money, and in return receiving winnings in cash and in kind. That's specifically been called out. So to us, that is a very clear indication of the government's intent to kind of provide some framework for real money gaming. Which I believe is the right way to go about it. There has been a lot of regulatory gaps, and currently the running of real money gaming, there has often been an existential threat of, is RMG allowed? Is it not allowed? And if it is not allowed, then what happens? So in the absence of, the government taking away that existential threat, I think there is a very clear resolve of legitimizing the industry. I believe somebody in the panel said it's an attempt towards legitimizing the industry, also to provide some kind of a safer framework for these companies to operate. And the third is to provide clarity in the event what happens when there have to be exits. Right? A lot of investors who've invested in RMG companies, often the question is, well, what happens? Are these companies going to be able to be sold to, let's say, to strategics or companies who want to buy these companies, or is there possibility of a listing? Both of these are only possible in the event of a regulatory framework, right? So when a company is, at least from the outside in, looking to buy assets, now RMG starts to become a part of that conversation, simply because, well, now there is a framework within which it can operate within this landscape. So overall, from an investor perspective, investor sentiment perspective, this is, I'd say, a very positive move. To try and provide a system, or at least a framework for it to for this industry to exist. More, but if we were to go down in nuance, I believe the center state lacunae and that dichotomy between the state saying we're going to ban some RMG assets and the center saying, well, there's a framework provided within which these RMG assets can exist, is still, I believe, confusing. And I'm hoping that these discussions feed back to the government and there can be resolution around that.
Great, thank you so much, Saloni, for adding that perspective. Now, actually coming to Zara as the gamer on the panel, your perspective of, because what I understand is that last year when consultations were happening, there was a concern raised by the gaming community and parents and others that, we also need to systematically look at gamers' rights and their, what are the kind of problems they face. And I think in this rules, an attempt has been made to do something in that direction. So my first question to you is that what has been your experience with gaming intermediaries? What are typically the kinds of issues that are faced by gamers? And do these rules help address some of those concerns? And I think it will also be good if you can talk about, I remember the conversation we had that, the concerns vary by game formats to some extent. So it'll be good if you can talk about that.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name is Sarah, and nice big question. I'm going to divide this into three parts. The first part, of course, being that, as I went through all these regulations, I realized that there's one major issue that nobody talks about is the fact that how clearly does everybody understand the differences in formats? Because, there's one way of looking at it from the law perspective, and then there are gamers who are sitting there and playing these games every day, and these are actually real problems that they face. So dividing this very clearly, esports starts for electronic sports is basically competitive gaming. Now, when we say competitive gaming, it means a skill-based sport. So any game that's played on a competitive title, it could also be Candy Crush, can be considered an esports title if they're making money out of it. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is the normal casual games, whether you take something as simple as chess and go put money in to register for a tournament where, tomorrow you'll make 150 rupees from it. That also is considered esports, even though it's not technically so high in advance on the skill of playing with a keyboard and mouse. It's still considered an esport title. Now, Ludo is considered a competitive game, but it's not considered an esport title because it's also considered a game of chance. Right? So there are lots of different kinds of things to keep in mind when you're looking at the rules, that for everybody the problem varies. Real money gaming also the problem varies. And when we look at the rules in specific, you'll notice that anywhere you deposit, so of course you deposit money in real money gaming, but you also do that for participating in tournaments abroad. You also do that to get a chance at, getting a slot at a South Asian tournament. So you cannot really just say it's one small little box where this rule will apply. Now, to start off with a simple example, like I have one of the people who are part of a welfare association. He's a chess player. He wanted to go ahead and play an international chess tournament. He put in money. He was from Tamil Nadu. And he couldn't take part in the tournament or take the cash money, even though he was the best at the tournament, only because it was in Tamil Nadu and it's banned over there to play the sport in that fashion, right? So that was a problem that really shocked us, because chess is not something where you need to define anything. Everybody knows what kind of game it is and the outcome that comes from the game. But because it's such a blanket rule, we got to fight both the battles, right? We got to understand that as soon as the regulations come in, how is it affecting children? How is it affecting adolescents? These are the people who are so digitally connected. They are the Gen Zs. They go onto a platform, they see Carom, they see Rummy, they see Ludo, they see so many different kinds of games. They may start off playing one game and get influenced by another game. It could lead to addiction. It could lead to different kinds of problems which they did not think that they would face, right? So there has to be some amount of regulation when it comes to the safety of the players. And if that is not there, then, it's very difficult to understand is everybody just free to do whatever they want to do? And especially for women also, you go onto sites, you'll be just playing a game, someone will send you a weird thing on your chat. There's nobody to really explain why this person could do this, or there could be also a simple link to hack your account and go ahead and take your credit card details and so on and so forth. And we've heard this not only through young gamers, but even elder gamers. Even women who play Candy Crush, for example, have come and complained that they were trying to buy something online for the game, and their account got hacked. So it's a very big framework. Everybody is a part of it, and every angle needs to be seen to while dealing with this. And I think that answers most of your question. Okay.
No, that really helped. I think that perspective is important to keep, especially, for instance, the gender lens also that comes in when you're looking at some of these issues. I'll come on more details on grievance in my next part to you. But Dhruv, if I can come to you, your take on behalf of the industry, what are your thoughts? As I see it, registration of games and oversight by the self-regulatory bodies is the main approach that these rules adopt. There have also been questions on, is this delegating too much? Is this delegating too little? And also one question I wanted to ask is, will this approach, like the registration approach, fix issues like accountability and fraud, etc., by offshore betting and gambling sites, and stuff like that?
Thanks, Sohit, for firstly organizing this event at such a short notice. Uh, Before answering your questions, I'll just take back to few of the things that was said. First point, and I'll definitely want to get into the formats of the game that we have discussed. So how I see it personally, correct? What we think in India right now, constitutionally, there's a binary sort of dichotomy between games. One is the game of chance, game of skill, correct? The courts, how at least for few of the high courts that I've seen, is that they say that entry 34 of the state list under the Constitution of India, you have betting and gambling. Betting and gambling, the courts have said, has to do only with game of chance and not game of skill. So what these rules are basically, if you read the rules, it says that if an SRO is registering a game, correct, that game should not fall under the purview of betting and gambling laws of the country, correct? It should not fall afoul of those betting and gambling laws. So how I'm reading it is that, that game cannot be betting and gambling, so it cannot be a game of chance. And the definition is such which is basically defining an RMG, a real money game, correct? Now, RMG can be of either chance or skill. Since it cannot be chance, it has to be skill, correct? Obviously, the government has not gotten into how to define it, how to decide it, but that's the principle they are following. A real money game, which is not a game of chance or which is not betting and gambling, can only be registered under the rules. That's how I am reading the formats. Another thing that we talked about is formats, correct? Like which game do you recognize as something or not? Like for example, a very interesting example there I took was Ludo, correct? Classic game of Ludo, most of the people believe it's a game of chance. However, what you will see is Indians being as innovative as they are, you will see a lot of formats of Ludo being changed, correct? And adding more skill elements, correct? You remove the chance elements and you make it more skill-based, and then you can convert that format into a skill game, correct? Which has been done by certain companies already. So the thing is, we can't even tag certain game as skill and chance at the moment. So we definitely need more clarity because there are ways to decide it. There are statistical ways to decide whether there's a skill or not. Obviously the Supreme Court has laid down certain subjective elements as to what is skill and not. So those can be applied. I think that burden might fall on the SRO and the industry to sort of develop that framework, as I think that's the expectation that the government has, correct? Now coming to the e-sport, it's a very interesting thing Zara said, correct? Because all online games can be played under any kind of format. It can be played as an RMG, it can be played as e-sport, it can be played as e-sport in a multi-sport event, correct? It can be played free to play also, in a freemium also. Same game can be played in any format, you just need to change the interaction with the game, correct? And that's why if you look at, before the rules came, the allocation of business rules were amended. Online game was given to MeitY as nodal ministry. However, e-sports as part of multi-sport event is under the sports ministry, correct? So what we have to see is that sports ministry will definitely come up with some regulation or some way to deal with esports as a part of multi-sport event, correct? So maybe if let's say your OVS, the Olympic Virtual Series or the Commonwealth Games, on those aspects the ministry will definitely come. But as Zahra's point, the esport where it is not part of multi-sport event, but also not a plain platform thing, that we have to see how that will play out. So these were the few points as to what I gathered from the discussion. Going to the accountability part
I
of
know,
it.
lots of sub-questions I asked together, but basically, yeah, that'll be great too.
Yeah. So in terms of, I think how we have to see is how at least the industry is looking at it. That the ministry has told us very clearly, user protection, safety, and due diligence standards is the paramount concern. Within that framework, you innovate. It is on you to make sure that your framework is robust enough. If it is robust enough, we will give you space to innovate, correct? You develop your framework. For example, All India Gaming Federation already has a charter which has almost all the elements that you'll find in the rules, correct? So it's upon you to decide how robust you want that framework to be and regulate. One of the problems, I'll give you an example, before these rules came, correct? For example, AIGF have about 90 to 100 members in RMG field. Most of them were following the charter. It is a voluntary association, but some people say there are about 800 gaming companies in the country, correct? What about the other 700 people, correct? They might not be following any standardized user protection guidelines or any standard in that way, correct? They might not be having a random number generator certificate. They might not be having a no-bot certificate. But now